And welcome back. So the goal is that we're going to finish I know there's never any way to do total justice to this, but we're going to finish our treatment of Islam's today. So what I've left before us is the holy days and the rites of renewal and the rites of passage. And then I'm going to talk briefly with you about sort of eschatologies, like what happens at the end of things. And then we'll just see if we have time for questions or conversation. So let's talk about the parties, right? The Islamic calendar begins with the Hijrah. So this is a celebration that you do every year, right? That's when the Prophet fled from Mecca to Yathrib, which is now Medina. So that happens every year annually. What date will it be every year? Remember, it floats because the lunar calendar doesn't align with the solar calendar. So all of these will float throughout the year. The Hijrah could be anytime, right? Ashura is an interesting one. That sort of culminates with like Moses, Noah and the ark, because that story is in the Quran, right? So this is a story about salvation and deliverance. So it's one of those sorts of holidays. This is still all in the first month of the Islamic calendar, which is called Muharram. Now, it is interesting to know that there's a major break in how Ashura is done between Shia and Sunni. So if you're a Shiite, Ashura is centered on the martyrdom of Hussein. Reminder, Hussein was descended from the Prophet, but not chosen to the caliphate. He led, frankly, a rebellion that was doomed to fail. I mean, like 1,000 against 90,000. And maybe Hussein thought that Allah would make this work, and he was wrong. But this Muharram Ashura mix, that's in Iran and Iraq, pretty much period dot. Those are the Shiite majority countries. You're not going to have Muharram even in Saudi Arabia. That's a Sunnite country.
So isn't that where, well, in Bahrain, they used to, we never actually saw it because we weren't advised to go, but they beat themselves with
sticks. This is sort of like in the Filipino tradition of Holy Week, where people whip themselves.
Yes.
Right? Flagellation is not just for Christian monks. Flagellation is for some Shiites. Like, if you're a Shiite Muslim, it doesn't mean you're going to be beating yourself, but there's a chance you will. There are parades too. Right. Like this is and people, if you've heard ululation, like, oh, or you've heard like loud weeping that's of like a cultural expression, that's showing up on Ashura in the Shiite tradition in the month of Muharram. If you're Sunnite, you're not doing that part. You're celebrating Noah and salvation. Hope that makes sense. Miladun Nabi. This is interesting because Arabic is a Semitic language like Hebrew, and a Nabi is a prophet in Hebrew. So a Nabi is prophet in Arabic. This is the birthday of Muhammad, peace be upon him. So this is Christmas, Muslim Christmas. Keep in mind, they didn't worship Muhammad, peace be upon him. They don't. They venerate him, but they don't worship him. But the prophet's birthday is this sort of joyous day, right? This is mislabeled. I'm so sorry. The Laylat-ul-Miraj is the night in which the prophet ascended into seventh heaven. He did this by getting onto this kind of chimera of a magical animal called a burak that's got, like horse legs and eagle's wings, etc., like different pieces put together. And he flew instantly from Mecca to Jerusalem. And then he put his foot on a rock and jumped into seventh heaven. And what do you know? He left his footprint in the rock. I mean, when you jump that high, it leaves a mark. So the dome of the rock is built over that. That gold dome building in Jerusalem, which is not a mosque, the shrine is over a rock with a kind of perfectly cut out footprint in it. And did I ask, has anybody been to the Dome of the Rock?
You have, didn't you?
I went
Yeah, I saw
before,
it.
I went in 2000, which was the last time a non-Muslim could go. If you go now, you can't go. You absolutely can't. You can't get on the Temple Mount, period, because it's Arabic controlled, and there's been some Jewish Zionists. I shouldn't call them Jewish. There's been some Zionists that tried to blow it up, like they had TNT and they were going to blow this thing up. So that's kind of excluded non-Muslims from going, which is very sad. Because it's gorgeous. Actually, the mosque that matters in Jerusalem is not the Dome of the Rock. It's about 100-yard football pass away to the Dome of the Chain, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam. So the Dome of the Chain, the Al-Aqsa, predates the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock was the Islamic Empire's sort of response to, hey, you've got the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, which is this architectural masterpiece. This is our architectural masterpiece. And it is geometric. I don't want to say it's perfect, because there's no such thing as a right angle, and there's no such thing as a perfect circle. It's pretty darn close. I mean, it truly is a masterpiece. Yeah.
Can you actually see the footprint in the rock?
If you go in, yes. Most viewers, right, you can see the Dome of the Rock from the Mount of Olives. That's what looks out over the Temple Mount. So you only see it from the outside. But inside, yeah, I mean, basically, the Dome of the Rock is an octagon. Sorry, this is going to be a hexagon, I know, but it's a perfect octagon with this dome on it. And then there's this rock inside, and you're meant to circumambulate that rock, just like you would circumambulate the Kaaba in Mecca. So this is the night where Muhammad, peace be upon him, ascends to heaven and gives a vision of seventh heaven. Okay, Laylat ul Burat. Not all Muslims celebrate this. It particularly happens in Southeast Asia, and it's essentially like Lent or Yom Kippur. This is like the night of being cleansed from sin, if that makes sense. So it's a penitential night. Laylat is night of, right? So then of course there's Ramadan, right? And Ramadan is, as I mentioned, the 28-day holiday of fasting. That's actually going to start in like a week. Ramadan. You remember, you don't eat or drink when the sun is out. So you're getting up early to eat and drink, and you're staying up late to do so. Again, that's Lent. That's the time between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I mean, these aren't equivalents, but they rhyme, right? So that's Ramadan, and then within Ramadan is the night of power. That's where this should go. Laylat ul-Qadar. This is essentially like the Jewish festival of Shavuot. This is the commemoration of when the archangel Jibril told Muhammad, peace be upon him, recite. So this is the night of revelation, the beginning of the revelation of the Holy Quran. Just like Shavuot is when Moses is up on top of the mountain. So it's the Jewish festival of the Torah. This is the Islamic festival of the Quran, night of power. And we know historically that it took more than one night to get the Quran. It took like 5 years. But this is like the first night of recitation, if that makes sense. We don't have anything like this in the Christian tradition, to my knowledge. There's not a celebration of the inspiration of the Bible. Eid al-Fitr is, and these words are pronounced a little differently. Eid, sometimes you call this Eid al-Fitr. Usually that's a very Western pronunciation. That's the end of Ramadan. That's when the fast is over. You begin with a feast. And I think I mentioned to you, the first thing that you eat is a date, always, because even though the feast was bitter, it was sweet. If that makes sense. You can go to Eid al-Fitr at an Islamic center. You know, like Islamic people don't usually freak out that you're interested. I don't know if this makes sense, what I'm saying. It is also true that you can go to a Seder if you like. Usually they're publicly available. You just have to pay for your meal, you know, like I think you can go to Shar HaShalom's Seder. It's somebody in the synagogue that caters it. If you want to go, like, I think you can go. Orthodox Seders tend not to be open, but like Seders are not meant to be exclusive. Now, we can't do them in the Episcopal Church. We can't do Christian Seders. And I've never done one. I've put on Jewish Seders here before. But I didn't talk about Jesus at all. If you were here, we just did this, we just did the Haggadah, which I think actually is very respectful. What we don't want to do is appropriate a Seder. I hope that makes sense. I don't want to talk about Eid al-Adha. Okay, all right, so those are the sort of the major festival days. There's more than this, just like there's more Christian holidays than this. The Feast of St. George, the Feast of St. Patrick, the Feast of St. Swithin. Like we have all of those feasts, so there are minority holidays too, but these are sort of the majors, right? And if I'm picking out what's most important to you, it's this one. That's one of the 5 pillars, right? That's this one. This is the beginning of your history. This is like when Jesus is born and we switch dating from BC to AD, which we no longer use any longer. Now we use BCE and CE, right, to be kind of respectful and inclusive. This is when there used to be BH before the Hijrah, and now we're in after Hijrah time in the Muslim calendar. So those are the big ones, if that makes sense. Any questions about these? So look, what are the other rites in Islam? Right, rites of passage, conversion to Islam. Reminder, you become a Muslim the first time you pray the Shahada. There is only one God, Allah, and Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the Rasul, is the prophet. The first time you pray that and mean it in prostration, that's like responding to the altar call in the Baptist church. Or getting baptized and confirmed. So there's no confirmation. There's the Shahada, so rite of passage number 1. It used to be, now this is not really the practice anymore unless it follows indigenous custom. It used to be that there would be a rite of passage from childhood to adulthood for men at the age of 13. Does anybody know what happened to Ishmael at the age of 13? He was circumcised by his father, Ibrahim. So it used to be Muslims in some places would wait until their boys were 13. That is not really a practice much anymore. Now, you may say how awful that is. Although Nelson Mandela was circumcised at the age of 16, not as a Muslim or Christian per se, but as a member of the Xhosa tribe. And Mandela would not call it barbaric. He would call it the rite of passage from boyhood to adulthood. So we have one view because we don't do it. They have a view that this is what we do and it's clear. Now you're a man. Actually, I don't want to say the rite's great, but I want to say having a rite of passage from boyhood to manhood, we don't have that, and it's sad because nobody knows when they're a man. And there's been some interesting urban studies in our country that say we don't have rites of passage to adulthood. We don't. But certain impoverished communities do. You become an adult when you're tried as an adult in court. You become an adult when you have a baby. Now we say those are inappropriate. It's a symbol of adulthood. Not healthy ones. But that does happen in some of our American communities, particularly urban communities. Yeah.
Well, you become a man when you have to register for the draft.
Used to be, Used to be, but since there hasn't been a draft since the 70s, and since we're military phobic as a country since the Vietnam War, rightfully so in some ways, there's not a ubiquitous definition.
No, but you still have to register.
You do, or you go to jail, but it used to be, I'm making this up, 50 years ago, you became an adult when you graduated high school. Or when you graduated college, or when you got married. But as you know, there's people who live with their parents when they're 33, having done all three of those things. Are they adults? We don't agree nationally about that. There's not a ceremony. I mean, there's a lot of research on this. Sociologically, we don't have a clear rite of passage to adulthood. We don't in this country.
What about for girls when they start menstruating?
Yeah, well, that's why I said in some impoverished communities, you become a woman when you have a baby. Because you're a mama now. So the earlier you can do that, the sooner you're an adult.
As a Hispanic, for me, maybe it was Catholic Hispanic, I'm not sure, but I think it was more about being Hispanic. It was a passage, it was a time of passage. And
Well, you have a quinceañera, right?
Más o menos.
In
Yeah.
some communities, a quinceañera is your
Yeah,
debutante ball, right?
yeah.
But there's girls who are getting their period at 9. That's not, sorry, forgive me for saying this. You're not an adult at the age of 9. And you're not an adult at the age of 12. Is that okay that I said that? So we get now, because you've got a physical change, that doesn't equal adulthood.
Right, okay.
And I think that's because I think that's right. But in traditional communities, that is the basis, right? So what do you know? Islamic girls become women when they're 12. Usually they start to wear the hijab a little before that, to make sure they're wearing the hijab before they start menstruating. They don't have to wear the hijab when they're 7. Because they're not women, they're girls. So anyway, I probably talked too much about rites of passage, but it's a problem.
No.
We use the term failure to launch in this country. That's because we don't have a rite of passage. We don't anymore. It's not confirmation. A lot of people want to get their kids confirmed when they're 12 because they have the suspicion that they won't want to do it later. So let's get it while we can get it done. My policy is you got to be 16 because 12-year-olds don't. I mean, sorry, like, just sorry, 12-year-olds don't know, cheaply done. Is it better than nothing? I don't know. And I don't know that I know, but this is part of the conversation. Okay, marriage also, rite of passage, obviously. There's different roles in Islam. I mean, I just went to an event that was stressing how dignifying Islam is to women. And maybe in Arabic traditional culture, although most of us Westerners would not find this dignifying, did you know if you're a woman and you earn money, you're allowed to keep it and spend it? This was one of the highlights about how Islam promotes the value of women. Well, we take it for granted. Thanks, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by the way, because she's the one who paved the way for this. Then women can own property and have credit cards. Like did you know women couldn't before Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by the way? So since the early 80s, women have been able to do these things. And so we could sort of take it for granted. But it is still very, very traditional, right? That women have very specific roles in the home, roles in the mosque, separate but equal roles. I just have to be honest. This is the case, separate but equal. We've had that in church until 1976. And even after that, it wasn't like everybody said, oh, women can be priests. You've changed our hearts, right? Some of us still don't know what to do with women clergy, if we're honest. Marriage is what it is. Now, it's interesting that there is, in the Islamic community, it's a very, very big deal to have monogamous relationships. So polygamy is not really a thing in Islam, socially tolerated. Sometimes it happens. And you're not supposed to have intercourse with a woman without being married to her, unless, this is interesting, there's loopholes in a few different Sharia, like in Iran, you can get a certificate of like, it's hard to say how to translate this. You can sort of have a casual relationship with somebody as long as you don't plan to marry them. This is like a very interesting thing. Or this is very much the case that if, particularly this is like a cultural understanding, not an Islamic, but a cultural understanding, like in countries like Egypt, not calling them to the carpet, but you can have intercourse with a non-Muslim woman because she's not Muslim. So it sort of doesn't count, which is why if you travel to Egypt as a single woman, you probably can expect some, what we'd call in this country, sexual assault, which would be people touching without permission. We don't call that groping anymore. We call that sexual assault because it is, just to be really clear, right? I was sexually assaulted in Egypt by men because I wasn't a Muslim. What does that mean? Nobody raped me, but people touched me when I passed through the street. Touching my back without permission is sexual assault. Touching my behind without permission is sexual assault in this country. So I'm not saying Muslims are weird. I'm not saying that. I'm saying there is this Islamic definition about, I mean, kind of like we have, like, hey, intercourse belongs within marriage. And then there are some cultural loopholes to that, depending where you go. I did tell you from the beginning, in Iran, if you touch a woman, there will be dire consequences. So we got our problems with Iranian politics. It's probably the only Middle Eastern country I'd send my wife by herself.
When I was in Saudi, the boss I worked for, who was Saudi, had 4 wives.
Yeah, so it can happen particularly and that's remember, the prophet had a couple of wives too. He was married to, but not at the same time. He was married to Khadijah. She died. He married Aisha. People in the Arabian Peninsula have had multiple wives, as in Africa. Hey, Abraham had multiple wives too. He had at least 2 at the same time, but he took a 3rd wife, Keturah, and had, a bunch of kids with her. So this is just part of the Semitic African heritage, multiple wives. So it kind of depends where you are. That still can happen, but it's not like, oh, it's an Islamic value. It's more of a cultural thing that happens in some Islamic expressions.
And also if you have the money.
And if you have the money, fair. Yeah. Hey, we all die, so death is a rite of passage. But that's sort of about it. The other rite of passage reminder is when you go on. So Eid al-Adha is a day that happens in the Hajj. It's the celebration that happens when you make the Hajj. And I mentioned to you, when you make the Hajj, one of those 5 pillars, which you do once in your life, that is a rite of passage. People thereafter will call you a Haji. Like it's a respectful title. Like before you go, you're Janel, and you're like Janel Haji. Like for the rest of your life. And so it does mark you as a rite of passage, because that's one of the 5 things you're meant to do. And then you did that. So rite of passage. And then, as I mentioned, death. There's not a rite of passage to being an imam. I mean, that's a volunteer. Or to being somebody who recites the Quran. I mean, everybody really should kind of learn how to do Quranic recitation. Or to being a muezzin. That's the person who does the call to prayer, Allah Akbar. I mean, these should be volunteer jobs unless you've got big enough infrastructure and that person's really spending a lot of time, then they might get a stipend for that. But that sort of just depends on the scale of where you're living. I hope that makes sense. There is a rite of passage in like the Shiite tradition, if you're going to be a mullah or an ayatollah, right? That's sort of climbing, not clergy ranks. Those are jurisprudence monks. A mullah is a judge. with civil and religious authority. An Ayatollah is a district court judge. And they have real civic power because of how they interpret the Hadith and the Quran into the Sharia, how we should live. Because that's civilly enforced in some countries. I hope that makes sense. So those are sort of, broadly speaking, the rites of passage. The rites of renewal, right? You pray 5 times every day. You give 2.5% of your net worth every year. You do Ramadan every year. Every Friday, if you're a man, you go to the mosque for Jummah. In Judaism, it starts Friday night. Friday afternoon, Jummah. If you visit an Islamic country, the day things will be closed is Friday. They'll be open Saturday and Sunday. Right? So men go to the mosque on Fridays, and that's like going to church on Sundays. Those are the basic rites of renewal. What happens when you die? Well, you've probably heard this. There's unfortunately, some bad information about this, like, oh, if you're a good Muslim man and you die in jihad, you go to a planet that's your own and you get like 52 virgins or something like that, right? And so, look, I'm not going to say that that's unfounded. I'm just going to say that's such a niche understanding of eschatology. It's not universal. What do Muslims believe? In heaven and hell. In heaven and hell. And who goes to hell? People who shirk or are non-Muslim or don't observe the pillars. Who goes to heaven? Well, it turns out you can go to heaven if you're Jewish or Christian, kind of, but it is very much dependent upon your faithfulness. Your faithfulness. It's not works-based, but if you're a low evangelical, it's works-based. I mentioned to you that in Shiite Islam, there's kind of like this left behind idea that the 10th Imam will come on a white horse and kind of end the world and particularly vindicate the Shiites. So imams, there are like imams that pass down, and there are imams that lead prayer. If you're Shiite, we're talking about imam with a capital I, that there's exactly 10, and the 10th is the harbinger of the end of days.
If God decides who's gonna go where, are there anything like in the Catholic Church, there's their confirmation and first Holy Communion and confession and the sacraments?
I mean, I think the best equivalent for confirmation is probably the Hajj, which not everybody has to do because not everybody can financially afford, but it's probably the next best thing. Because when you go on the Hajj, you've dedicated your time and your resources to remembering the story.
Do male and female go?
Absolutely, male and female alike go. Yeah,
Oh,
our Hajjis, yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, but there's not like a confirmation for youth, no. And part of it is, and this is actually part of the lovely part about Islam, they really, and I say this, the Hajj is an honor that you get for life, but it doesn't make you better than anybody else. I mean, part of the lovely part of Islam is everybody's the same. The clergy are not better because in general, clergy are volunteers. And what do you have to do in Islam? These 5 things which anybody can do. Clergy have to do them too, and you don't need clergy to do any of them. Consider, if you're Catholic, you have to have the Eucharist. You have to have the sacrament. But you can't give yourself the sacrament. You have to have clergy for that. Islam is not clergy dependent for anything. There is something mesmerizing about watching 6 million people all prostrate themselves in synchrony. Now, this is part of the universality and the equalization. When you go on the Hajj, rich, poor, famous, infamous, You're all wearing the same cheap clothes. And you're all bowing. And Eid al-Adha, right? This is in the Hajj, that's the day you offer a sacrifice. And if you don't have enough money, the person who does shares it with you. So you slaughter a lamb, but you eat it and you share it. Sounds like Passover. But that's a thing you do as equals. You don't glamp. There are tents in the desert. Everybody gets the same tent, or is supposed to. So that equality among men is like really lovely and compelling. And again, women can go on the Hajj too, and they don't have to like shave their head when they come back. They don't. Men shave their head on the Hajj. Women don't have to do that.
How old are they? Is there an
You're
age?
supposed to be an adult. You're supposed to be an adult, so you should be more than 13 or 12. In
Okay.
general, if you go before you're 18, you call it like a real good practice run.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, usually you go at 18.
Okay.
There ain't anything magic in Islam, unless you're Shiite. And magic is interesting, right? There's not like relics, but there's holy people and they are enshrined. So you go, but you don't, it's not like Lourdes, right? Where there's like, the only magic thing is there's that well in Mecca that has a holy water called Zamzam, but it doesn't like cure your cancer. It's just sort of the idea that it's holy water, but it's not magical water. I don't know if that makes sense.
Since the Shiites can't go to Mecca.
Iranians can't go to
Okay,
Mecca.
okay. So,
They don't bar all Shiites.
oh, okay,
It's a political business, right? And this is the sad bit, that Mecca lives in a country that's controlled by a Sunnite majority that has a lot of power. And when you use your political boundaries and territory punitively against other countries, are you punishing the country, or are you punishing your fellow brothers and sisters who have to come to Mecca? Sad bit of posturing, my own opinion. Remember, I told you that Iranians were denied visas because several Iranians were trampled and the government demanded a response. And the response was no more visas for you.
there was also, when I was there, I guess it was Shiites, that I'm not sure what they took over. But yeah, I think they took over something near Mecca or something. And they got, when they got captured, they were spread around the country and then had their heads chopped off.
Yeah. You know, this is a really interesting thing. Has anybody ever heard the phrase black on black violence? Like, oh, why is there so much black on black violence? Nobody ever says there's white on white violence. Have you noticed that? So it's a really interesting thing that we've created a category that says, well, black people shouldn't be violent against black people. Or what's all this Muslim on Muslim violence? You remember that thing that happened called the 30 Years' War, where more Christians killed each other in 30 years than any of the world wars that have happened since then? That was Catholic Protestant. That was Christian on Christian violence. So we just need to be honest. That's in our tradition too. So when we hear about fissures between Shia and Sunnite, they're no different from us. Violence. This is a thing. This is a sad thing, but it is true. And most of it has little to do with how we read the Quran. Most of it has to do with the structures of power that again invested in those Quranic reads. Yeah. I mean, you're probably aware that Saddam Hussein was a Sunnite leader in a Shiite majority. Iraq's a Shiite majority, barely, like 53%. And what did Saddam Hussein do? Repressed the Shiite majority as a Sunnite minority. You ever heard of the Iran-Contra affair? That was us selling weapons to fuel Muslim on Muslim violence. We did that. And then what do you know? Saddam Hussein used the weapons we sold him to invade Kuwait. How could he do that? Anyway, okay. So please understand that a lot of our own Islamophobia, we have invested in. I don't mean you invested in that. I mean, people made a decision to invest in that. Ever heard of the School of the Americas?
Oh, yeah.
This is where we train people on how to be terrorists. And then, well, you know, they went back to their countries and they were terrorists against US interests. Like several of the narcos in Mexico, we trained them how to do what they're doing. Osama bin Laden went to the School of the Americas. We trained him how to be a terrorist when the Russians invaded Afghanistan. And then what do you know? When that was over, Osama bin Laden was like, I don't want to be controlled by you either. So, wow, we bit the hand that fed him. But violence tends to like create more violence. I hope we've learned our lesson. I don't know. I guess I'm being real political now. But sometimes we say, why would anybody be like that without realizing we invested in that as a country? We did. Like we have made our bed that we lie in very uncomfortably. And all of this is more political than it is religious. There is something really lovely to the discipline of, I'm going to stop what I'm doing and pray 5 times a day. Like if I'm in the middle of a car sale, we're going to stop. If I'm like writing the last page of my novel and the call to prayer goes off, I'm going to get up. There's just something really lovely about that. My opinion, right? Really lovely about that. What does Islam have to figure out? It's got to figure out the role of women in an increasingly westernized world, right? Has to figure that out. Got to figure out what happens between Arabian culture and Islam spiritually. Do you have to have one to have the other? We're still figuring that out in Christianity post-colonially. We've made some advancements, but we've had a 600-year head start. So like just sort of keep that in mind, right? Separation of church and state, separation of Sharia and government. There's been a couple of places where that's been tried and it's gone up and down. Like Turkey was a secular country under Kemal Ataturk. Erdogan has taken it back the other way. Maybe it'll come back out. I mean, we don't know, right? Reza Shah in Iran was very successful. His son wasn't so good. Islamic Revolution, right? So that one's kind of swung back and forth. Benazir Bhutto elected as a female prime minister in Pakistan, but what do you know? In tribal Pakistan, not super well controlled with the government, you've got the Taliban. So issues, right? Issues like that. Particularly when we talk about women's rights, and I'm not being critical, but it's an interesting thing to say, we respect women's fundamental dignity so much that they have to wear this when they go in public. That's interesting to me. I have a hard time as a Westerner with that. And I'm going to admit it's probably because I'm a Westerner. But that's still the case. That Islam is coming to terms with that. You know when a woman does not have to wear a hijab, just at home. Yeah, just at home.
Or if she comes to visit and your husband or brother isn't around, she'll take it off.
It's all women.
Yes, just.
It's all women. Yeah. In fact, in Shiite countries like Iran, there's 2 different knockers on the door. One if it's a male visitor and one if it's a female, so the woman knows if she needs to put her hijab on in her home. That's kind of a cool thing. They make different noises on the door. And it's sort of interesting, like look down a residential street and see these 2 slightly different knockers on every house. It's just kind of cool. I'm not sure what else there is to say about Islam.
Can I just say something about the weekend? We were in Bahrain more than 50 years ago, and the weekend was Thursday and Friday. Friday is always the holy day, but Thursday was like our Saturday. That was when you did Saturday things. When we were back in Doha and Qatar 12 years ago, it had shifted. Friday was the holy day, and Saturday was the day off. Do you know if all countries do that, or when?
I do think it depends. I mean, again, like last time when I was in Iran, Friday was the holy day and the day off.
And what about Saturday and Thursday?
Everything was open.
Yeah, oh yeah, everything was open, but there was, there was no college, no work.
I don't know about college. That's an interesting question. I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah. I
no,
don't
I
know.
don't either.
I know that Iranian college students went to school on Sundays, so I know that.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
oh yeah, we did too, yeah, too.
Yeah.
The Quran is written in Arabic. Has the Quran had any kind of like changes since it was first written?
The Islamic claim is no. Although there are some early documents that have minor variations. But the Islamic claim, remember, the main claim is that the Jewish and Christian scriptures have corruptions in them, like translation errors or copy errors. I'll tell you that's the case. Therefore, the Quran is like inerrant,
Right.
it's problem solved.
Right.
And again, the Quran includes a lot of the stories with some minor twists, right? Abraham goes to sacrifice his son. Turns out it's Ishmael, not Isaac.
Yeah.
Jesus shows up in the Quran. In fact, Mary gets pregnant without being married. It's not God's baby. Like, Allah would never do that. But Jesus, like, comes out talking. So he's like a miraculous kid. He's a prophet. Remember, his name's Risa. And Jesus is the one who works miracles. He's the last miracle worker. Muhammad, peace be upon him, didn't heal anybody, right? Mary is like an important lady in Islamic faith. Like, she's got a big role. Well, she's got her hijab on too.
Is she an intercessor?
No, there's no intercessors because everybody's equal.
Okay.
And you never pray to a human being, you pray to the one transcendent Allah. Yeah, even in the Shiite tradition, when you venerate a member of the Prophet's family, you'd never pray to them. But there is something, it's probably like the way Episcopalians view saints.
Mhm.
They don't do acts of power for you in heaven, but you'd like to be like them when you grow up, right? Like that sort of idea. Like you quote them, or you try to embody acts of charity.
Is in the Episcopal Church is Mary an intercessor?
We don't have a doctrine on that. If you want her to be, go ahead. And there are Episcopal churches that are what we call Anglo-Catholic that will say the Hail Mary after the Mass. And I use that word on purpose. If your church uses the word Mass, that's an Anglo-Catholic word. Mainstream word is Eucharist. So after the Mass, you might have a Hail Mary in an Anglo-Catholic church. Rarely after the Eucharist will you have the Hail Mary. Hope that makes sense. Yeah. Look, I was just at an event and it was interesting. I don't know if you know this, up by Ellington Field, there's an Islamic school.
Right.
Like a day school where you can go, because we actually have pretty decent sized Muslim population here in Clear Lake. It grows every year. They have an all Muslim scouting unit, Cubs, and I don't know if girls can be scouts. I don't think so. I think they just have the boys unit up there. And they have something called the Multicultural Center, which is like an event space. It's not a mosque, right? So there's a mosque right over here by the Unitarians. The Islamic Center is both a mosque and a cultural center, but the Multicultural Center is an event space for like Muslim weddings, or like they do a bazaar every year, and it's lovely. It looks like a beautiful, elegant hotel with huge crystal chandeliers. And they just had an event on Sunday called Know Your Muslim Neighbor, KYMN. And it was basically an invitation to people. I would tell you the agenda was Americans are Islamophobic, and Muslims can be very committed Americans. I wish that's what they called the event. But it was called Know Your Muslim Neighbor. So they showed a couple of videos about like the 5 pillars, short video about the Hajj. They had a dinner that was catered by like a halal place. So it was Middle Eastern food, you know, like ground up beef that's been put on a skewer and barbecued, and pita bread and tabbouleh, which is all lovely food, like it's all tasty, right? They had a couple of speakers who talked about Islamophobia after 9/11 and the way that like some Muslim students get discriminated against in this country. I'm sure that's true, right? They had a panel of people who answered Q&A that were preset, and I will say it was an interesting thing talking about the Gaza-Palestinian conflict because my new friend Rabbi Krull was at the table with me, and he is an Israeli and he's a conservative Jew, so he's like double interested in it, right? And Rabbi Krull told me afterwards, he's like, you know, we don't ever talk about politics publicly. We don't, because it's difficult. And the event was like very difficult because it sort of, there were some speakers that were like, this conflict is very disgusting, ceasefire now, right? Sounds really easy. And Rabbi Krull's like, you can have a ceasefire right now, return the hostages. So like, anyway, this is really, really complicated, Islamic relations. It's complicated not because they're Muslim, because we've attached political power to religious life. I don't know how we get away from that, but I just want to be really clear on that. And this is part of what we have to figure out globally, right? Anyway, it was an interesting event. Very, but I would say it was very like introductory. Like Muslims can be American. Of course, Muslims can be American. I mean, Barack Obama was Muslim, right? And he swore his oath to office on the Quran. Please don't say things like that, because that's ridiculous. He was neither Muslim nor did he swear the oath of office on the Quran. This is when you hear things like that, that is latent Islamophobia that we still have to deal with. So if you hear somebody say that, say, why don't you consult the video evidence? Because there's video evidence to oaths of office, right? These are like things that sound true enough because you know what his middle name was. Hussein, which is the 9th Imam, because his father was African Muslim. But Barack Obama attended the Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., to be really clear. So again, sometimes we hear this thing and because we have since 9/11 Islamophobia, we do. It's baked in. We're sifting some of it out, but it is baked into us in the United States, sadly. It's good to be very mindful of this. And look, I'm no more critical, and I'm telling you, this is my own culture about women wearing hijabs than I am about how women get treated in evangelical and Roman Catholic traditions, which I find disgraceful. So I said that. So I'm equally critical of all religions and creeds that say women are equal but separate. But that's just me, and I could be wrong. I just am not wrong in my own family, because my wife would divorce me if I didn't think that. So there we go. But if we were Muslim, she couldn't. Yeah. Okay, what else about Islam? Anything?
Shortly after 9/11, I gave myself the exercise of reading the Quran in English.
Yeah.
And two things struck me. One, incredibly beautiful descriptions of heaven, of the seventh heaven or paradise.
Yeah.
And two, on the other side was some of the verses that could have been easily twisted to be very violent, like behead the infidels whenever you see them, or you find them. And I'm thinking, yeah, I can see how that could be could give what's the word for reason for someone to some justification to do violence in the name of Allah.
Yeah, and there's this weird bit, right? You ever read the book of Deuteronomy? It says the way that you fight a holy war is you kill every man, woman, and child, and you burn all the stuff. That sounds really violent. So much so that that's why we've never done it, because nobody would ever fight a war if there was no profit to be had. You would never send your son to fight a war if there was not a profit for him or you. Which is why we've never fought a holy war, because nobody ever will. And in some ways, maybe that's why it's there, to say not that you should, That's what it takes, which is why we don't do that. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's in our Deuteronomy. And you know what most Christians do with that is to say, oh, that's because the Jewish God's a vengeful, angry God. But Jesus brought us grace and love, which is anti-Semitic, wrong, because that's our holy scripture. And by the way, there's some kind of violent stuff in the New Testament too. Like Herod gets killed for being a blasphemer. So it's so easy for us to brush aside the issues we've got and say, you all are crazy for doing that. You read the book about the talking donkey? Oh, but you know, the Mormons, there's like gold, there's magic glasses and golden tablets. Like, no, that's not really different from what we've got in our stories that have some really weird stuff. But they're not ours, so they're crazy. So it's just really helpful to remember, if it sounds weird, let's think a little carefully about what we just accept that's weird.
We've heard those stories since we were a child,
Yeah, and they're normalized.
and so it's very normal.
They're very normalized, but I mean, it's wizardry stuff, right? We've got that. It's just like you said, we've accepted it. Yeah. So what's weirder, a magical amalgam animal that flies the prophet to Jerusalem, or the talking donkey? The prophet going to seventh heaven, or the Apostle Paul doing it? Because the Apostle Paul claims he went to seventh heaven. I know someone who did, is what Paul says. Like, I know a guy who did that, right? This is the claim in our scriptures. We have 7 heavens since Dante Alighieri and John Milton, right? Are there 7? I mean, I don't know. Not in the Bible. There's just one. And it's on earth. So there's that. Yeah.
Well, we all know that Francis is a talking mule,
Francis the Talk.
and we've all seen Francis.
Yeah, so these are just things to remember, right? Again, anytime you think like that's crazy, let's just stop and think about what we just accept, right? Sometimes this is Islamophobic. Now, look, I can say this thing that I'm not sure about this whole business about women's rights, but that doesn't disqualify me from saying Muslim people deserve our respect and appreciation. Maybe I sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but I've got criticism about the Episcopal Church. I'll share it with you openly. I still think this is where I belong, but there's things I don't like. And my mind changes every like 6 minutes. So there. So it is an interesting thing. If you've never been to a prayer, if you want to go to the Islamic Center, you can go anytime and observe them making one of their 5 daily prayers. Like, they will accept you openly as a guest. Usually they'll give you a translation of the Quran if you like. It won't be the Holy Quran, but you can read through it. It's not long. It's shorter than the New Testament. So that's a thing you can do. The Hadith is very long. Stories about the Prophet, very long. Quran, not so long.
Did you go Sunday night?
I did, yeah.
Well, I tried to register, but
And it was,
closed.
yeah, they closed it and there was plenty of room, oddly
Okay.
enough. So
Well, that's what my neighbor next
Nan
door
and
told me.
Susan went there.
She's Muslim. And she said, I would just advise you to go ahead and go. There
yeah,
would be
nobody
more
likes to do
room."
that when there's a ticket though.
I know.
Right,
Okay.
but people didn't show up. And again, I'm just trying to think, like, know your Episcopal neighbor. Nobody would ever go to that event, because like, you ever told somebody like about the Episcopal Church and just seen like, I mean, I was in a residential home yesterday visiting somebody, and I mentioned I was Episcopalian priest, and I could tell the person was like, what the hell? I don't care. Like they had no idea. They're like, well, the Catholic guy comes every Friday. I'm like, yeah, but the difference is non-Catholics can take the communion I offer, and only Catholics can take that one. What tradition are you from? Like that was, anyway, like it's just this thing, right? Because we have become, we used to be a super majority in this country.
Yeah.
And now we've become actually pretty ultra minority as a denomination.
Episcopalians?
Yeah, we're pretty small. Well, yeah, we're pretty small in number. I mean, we have a disproportionate share of power and wealth, but small in number compared to, say, the Southern Baptist Convention, the
Oh, yeah.
Methodist Church, the Catholics, Presbyterians. These are all bigger than us. I mean, we have more U.S. presidents than any other tradition, but you know, that's because we were the religion when we were founded, right? I mean, that was it. You can still go to George Washington's church and sit in his seat. Unless it's claimed by somebody. Anyway,
There's a bank downtown, a very old bank, that when we were on a tour, we were told that it has the largest collection of Islamic papers than any place
Interesting.
else in the United States. It's close to that historic square.
I mean, I'll tell you that I'm an Islamophile. Islamic art to me is gorgeous. I just, different mosques, and particularly the Iranian mosque to me is like the pinnacle of beauty. And so is the Dome of the Rock. I mean, it's just, it's breathtaking to see geometric perfection, if that is such a thing. I mean, it's really, really lovely. Islamic food is among the best. I mean, I would say in the world. Islamic food is very, very delightful. So if you haven't had it before, you're missing out.
Well, I think that I admire so much, and having gone to Bali as many times as I did, and you could hear the call to prayer and their devotion to just
Yeah.
stopping to
stop.
pray. Yeah, I admired and I coveted enough, but not enough to be that.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because I'm like you. And it would be so easy for me just to set a calendar reminder 5 times a day to stop.
But we're busy there.
And I'd rather admire other people who do it
Mhm.
than just do it. That's a weird thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you realize that we have daily office 4 times.
Yep.
It's just most people don't do it at all. We have morning prayer, afternoon prayer, evening prayer, and compline in the prayer book. And most people like, I'll do morning prayer once a week for Lent. Thomas Cranmer thought we were supposed to do it every day of our life. And I don't do it every day. And maybe you don't have to do the whole thing. Maybe it's just if we set a 5 time a day alarm, and I will tell you, prostrating yourself in prayer because we don't do it, it's uncomfortable, it's weird, it's actually pretty lovely. There is something lovely about adopting a posture that's for prayer only. That's why I kneel in the service, because I don't do that anywhere else. So to me, that's special because I don't do it anywhere. I don't kneel at home. I don't kneel in my car, right? You get this, right?
I feel that way about kneeling.
Yeah.
I never thought about it. I mean, but
It's part of why I'm Episcopalian, because it's built into the structure. We have kneelers that support it, or we have cushions, and putting your body in this posture is special to me. I don't think I'm kneeling before God the King. I don't accept that theology because that's too pyramidal for me. But I do think like I'm doing something special with my body.
going to communion and kneeling, I think it's
Yeah.
just,
And not everybody can kneel, so it's just important to think
Yeah.
through that. But since I can, it's meaningful to me.
You have a feeling of reverence.
yeah.
That's
Because
part
it's
of why I'm
special.
Episcopalian.
But I think if I went down on the floor.
You may not get
it
up.
No, I would not. It would take a come along.
Yeah.
and pull me back.
I've
up.
got 3 of them, but
But then the people who've done it, beginning at a young age and continue, they most old people can still do that.
this would be interesting. And I'll say, if anybody seen the documentary Super Size Me about eating McDonald's every day for 30 days?
I would
This is
die.
an interesting documentary, came out probably in 2000, where this guy eats McDonald's every day, 3 times a day for 30 days and monitors what it does to his physical and emotional health. It's really bad. You probably all get that, right? And that was groundbreaking at the time because we just weren't thinking about our food. He ended up making a show called 30 Days where he invited, and it was only like 3 seasons. He invited people to do a thing for 30 days and describe their experience. And in one of the shows, he has a guy from West Virginia who's like a Southern Baptist live with a Muslim family in Dearborn, Michigan, and do the 5 daily deals. And the guy struggles with whether or not it's idolatry to pray to Allah, or whether he should do the prayer posture. And so it's just sort of an interesting thing to hear this evangelical have this conversation about it. And ultimately, like what he says at the end is like, I was so resistant to this, but it's like such a beautiful, compelling way of life. And so like, I think if you wanted to give yourself an experiment, try prostrating yourself 5 times a day for a week and just see how it feels total, not just on your knees, but how it feels inwardly. Don't pray to Allah if you don't want to. You know, pray the Paternoster, pray the Our Father in the prostrate position, and give it a week
And try to get up.
and try to get up. Try to get up. Yep, have a come along ready. Okay, if that's it for Islam, I did have a follow-up from Betty, asked me about our Orthodox presenter. So Monday night, we had, didn't you ask me? No,
was me.
Darlene did. Darlene asked me about Father Caliandra's presentation. Would you repeat the question for everybody?
How does their theology of not having the fall? They're not believing in the fall. How does that affect their other theology and their life?
What it does, right? So keep in mind, when we talk about the fall, and I mentioned this in Christian history, right? This idea came around with Augustine, and it came out of the Platonic tradition, not the Jewish tradition. So Jewish people don't believe in that. And Orthodox people don't believe in that either because it wasn't original. You don't have to believe in it as an Episcopalian. We don't have a doctrine about the fall. So you don't have to. But if you don't have to, then you kind of are like John Locke, where you say we're born either, or Rousseau. Do you know this? There's the 3 big philosophers, Hobbes, Leviathan. We are evil, and we need government to constrain us, because left to our own devices, we will eat each other. Sadly, there's evidence for that, right? Then there's John Locke, who said we're born a blank slate. Like babies are not inherently evil or good. Society will take them either way. And that's our legal systems based on John Locke. And then there's Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who says, hey, we're basically good people, but society can bend us. Jewish people are Rousseauian. We're born good. And then we've got to resist things that would warp us. I actually think that's probably the right view. But if you don't have a fall, that takes you out of Hobbes. So you're not going to hell when you die if you're not an unbaptized baby. That's not happening to you. And when you do things that are bad, it's not like, oh, this is human nature. No, that's social corruption of inherently good human nature. So what does that do theologically? It takes your impetus from we're basically bad. You should expect us to murder and lie and steal. Instead, like, no, that's not expected. That's things we get to repent from when we go amiss, but that's not our inherent character. So that means, like, what he said is, like, you don't go to confession to, one of the things he said, you don't confess to a priest. The priest is like your midwife for confession. You're confessing to God with a human being helping draw that out of you. And that's kind of what we do in the Episcopal Church, right? We don't have a sacrament of confession. We have a sacrament of reconciliation, where I'm the midwife. I don't absolve you. I announce God's absolution so you can hear it. It's already happened, but in the rite, you get to hear it. So, and for me, that's why you can go to reconciliation, not because you committed one of the 7 deadly sins. You can go to reconciliation for anything that has you concerned, anxious, separated from your fundamental goodness and value and dignity and God's presence wherever you find yourself. Whether that's regret or grief or remorse or worry or anxiety, you can confess that and be reconciled in that rite, because you're worth it. I don't know if that made sense.
Thank you, yeah, absolutely.
It was very interesting, wasn't it?
He's a fine speaker. I'm sorry, I wish I'd recorded it.
Oh,
His son did. His son Caleb had a phone out. I mean, he was a lovely speaker. Yeah, he was lovely.
And he exuded his own spirituality.
He absolutely did. He was very authentic and very warm.
Mhm.
right? And so I really enjoyed him. This was our speaker who came Monday night from the Orthodox tradition. Yeah, and he's very welcome. Galveston's a drive, but he would be more than welcome to host us in the church if we chose to make that drive and have a tour, et cetera. And maybe that's a better afternoon activity that we could go to at some point and have lunch on the island. Maybe we could do that next year. Evening, that's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, as you know, it's hard for working folks to go, but whatever, we'll figure it out. Okay, here's the plan then. Then next week, we'll meet at 10, not 9, 10, and we'll have the introduction to Hinduisms, and that S on the end is so important in Hinduisms, more so than any of the others. There is no such thing as Hinduism. I'm just gonna tell you now, there's no Hinduism. There's Hinduisms. And they vary by every individual in every village and every city. So we'll start next week, knowing that in 2 weeks, we're gonna take that one off because it's spring break. So I'll introduce us next week, 10 to 11:15, then we'll take the following week off and we'll come right back in.
And you know, in South Houston, there is a Buddhist temple.
Yes, Hindu temples, there's one in Pearland.
In Bay Cliff, and also, some little towns south, I guess it would be
There's one in
west of
Santa Fe has one.
Santa Fe, that's the one